Blockchain is the underlying technology which uh, for cryptocurrencies such as bitcoins. The idea being in this scenario is that uh, you need to cut down the number of intermediaries in a financial transaction. Uh, so you make sure that everyone knows uh, what is actually happening at each other's ends. So a sender knows exactly where the money needs to be sent to, and the receiver will know exactly whether the person has the money on his end or not. So it's a trust-based system which you need to make sure that there is abundant amount of information so that the transaction occurs, and it's a distributed ledger where everyone in the system who has access to the blockchain knows exactly what is happening.
Situation where different actors do not trust each other, what do you normally do? You set up an intermediary who you all trust. I mean, the classic example being currency, right? I mean, I don't know whether what you are giving me is of value, therefore, I rely on the RBI, which, authenticates or, certifies that to hold value, right? So that is the centralized intermediary concept. But in the blockchain situation, what you are basically doing is creating an architecture where you are decentralizing the intermediary's role of certifying a particular transaction or a certain asset class, for that matter. So how do you do that? Through computing. Basically, you're doing it through using computational power by creating multiple nodes, all of whom in a public blockchain or some of whom in a private blockchain have the power to authenticate a particular transaction. And then, of course, there are different protocols or consensus mechanisms. The concept of public and private in the context of blockchain is less to do with sharing and more to do with who can authenticate a particular transaction or not. So in a public blockchain, classic example is Bitcoin, right, where every node can technically, authenticate a particular transaction. I mean, the mining nodes are the ones which authenticate it, and there is no choice made as to who the mining nodes can be. Only thing is whether you meet the proof of work, consensus protocol standards. But in the case of a permissioned ledger system or a private blockchain, you select certain group of entities who have more preferential rights to authenticate that particular transaction. So that's broadly the distinction. Now, when it comes to access, and that's where we come to the privacy bit. So I'm coming to that. So I think the first distinction, obviously, there is then between a distributed database and a distributed ledger system, where you do away with the intermediary. You have a bunch of nodes in a private blockchain, or you have all the particular nodes without any sort of selection process, really, except your technical capability to authenticate the transaction in a public blockchain system, right? So that brings your distributed ledger technology into the forefront there. And the next thing is, then what does it do in terms of one, security, and two, the confidentiality issue, right? So on the security front, so there are two different things here, right? One is that the database then is basically replicated across different nodes, right? So each node can view the database, but from a security standpoint, it's important because you're not talking about centralized storage here, but decentralized, right? As a result of which, basically, anytime there is a change made to the database, all the particular nodes in that system, or the permissioned ones in a private blockchain, have to verify that and authenticate that change. As a result of which, it's an immutable database, but it is located in multiple different points or nodes, right? So that's the first thing. So on the security front, that's where it's a plus on existing database centralized database solutions. But on the privacy aspect or the confidentiality aspect, and this is particularly important because there has been a lot of talk about how blockchain can, for instance, solve privacy, and why Aadhaar can be blockchained and so on. So I think we have to be very clear that in a public blockchain, you are essentially talking about each node being capable of viewing the data, right? So if you're talking about confidential data, then you need to be careful about what kind of solution you're deploying, whether it's a public blockchain system or a private blockchain. Confidentiality is an issue because not everything in the supply chain transactions are meant to be viewed by all the different actors, right? But you need to restrict access, and in that space there is still research going on, so we do not have a foolproof sort of solution, even if it's a private blockchain so architecture that we deploy, because there are possibilities of re-identification and so on. Now the real value of the decentralization mechanism is when you can code the transactions, in the sense that all this data is meant for a certain purpose, right? For instance, you look at supply chain, or classic example in some of the use cases in the finance sector currently, when it comes to international transactions, and how you can transact and reduce the transaction time. Instead of each actor taking a particular action, intimating that, and then the other actor being in a position to verify that, you basically create an architecture where everybody can on real time basis view what action has been taken. So that's the first sort of thing, right? We are disseminating the information. Now on top of this, suppose you build payment systems, right, where if this X act has been done, right, the system itself decides that Y payment will be made to Z actor in this particular chain, right? So that is a smart contract, in the sense that instead of relying on a written, I mean, you will obviously have a written contract at least in the transition phases, but instead of waiting for actors to take the next step, the code itself drives the next step. So these are largely B2B sort of settings where this is happening, and therefore one issue is there a real privacy threat, because most of these are basically consent based, right? I mean, I as Kotak Mahindra Bank, and vendor A who is or consignor A who is dispatching a consignment to consignee B, right, all of them are in this situation, basically parties who have consented to this transaction, because you have efficiency gains. So as a result of which, while of course the smart contract will be in a position to, for instance, evaluate whether there is X amount of money left in the bank, right, and as a result of which you will be able to sort of verify whether payment should be made or not, right, so or can be made or not, right. So all of this in my view is basically consent led, in the sense that you are allowing this particular software to read into the bank account, you are allowing the bank to share it with the technology solution, and so I think when there is a consent based response here, privacy concerns could be less. Now when you start doing this, let us say for consumer banking and so on, right, where currently I don't think there are any solutions which are built on a blockchain. I think there you could say that consent is not a good enough answer, because you're creating an entire system of verifying your consumer banking data and so on, which is available to multiple different nodes. First question is, are banks comfortable doing it? Second is there a big value proposition for the consumer in deploying blockchain
Right.
there? Consent only addresses the latter, it doesn't look at the former. So when it's a harm-based approach or a rights-based approach, basically you are going to look at the systemic risks involved in any kind of data sharing and
Okay.
storage mechanism.
Okay.
So yeah, so that is where I think, so you'll have to then look at what the systemic risks are with blockchain, which
Okay.
are different. Like in the papers that we have circulated, it's evident, right? The risks are different systemically, because while at one end you have more security in terms of more nodes storing the data, you could have a system what you call a 51% hack, right?
Yeah.
So you have a proof of work concept, but then 51% is by particular mining node you can sort of override the other nodes. So those are the risks that you have. More than even the manufacturing and industrial IoT, where I think there could be a lot of application is the smart cities project, right? Because you're talking about multiple sensors in multiple different kinds of sites, whether it's water, electricity, energy, mobility, etc. Checking your environment and sensors to detect air quality. So you have all this data coming from multiple gadgets. But more than the data coming from multiple gadgets, the real thing is who can take action, right? So I think a city can only really be smart if different actors in the governance of that particular city are talking to each other. They're able to view the data. So you can create open data registries, and already there is a lot of talk about creating dashboards, right? And these dashboards, for instance, Bangalore has a dashboard project where, if there is a digging of any particular location, all the different actors invested in it, your water lines, I mean, your electricity guys, your, telecom guys, all of them can, see it. And there is a permissive, sort of regime to give permission for that digging if any particular entity applies. The others can say, okay, this is where we are planning to do it as well, but we will take another 2 months, so maybe we should hold on. So you don't have multiple digging on the same site. You have. So now all of this open data registries is again a use case that we have already shared in that, So open data registries, yes, I think blockchain can really work well to give multiple nodes access to that particular data, which is coming from all these devices, right? And I think in the context of smart cities, this is particularly important. In manufacturing as well it is, because you can then have different nodes of that particular activity of manufacturing, like procurement, sales guys, your compliance guys, all of them to view the data at the same time and be able to take decisions, right? So it helps decision making. So I think blockchain has important applications there, but we'll have to see whether these applications are materially different from what I initially mentioned as a distributed database. I mean, if it's a distributed database, model, I mean, I don't think we need to really call it blockchain. We can just have it as an open data model, because we don't really need to do any computing on it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so that's one way of.
In financial transactions, and I guess you guys can help me. I've always wondered, I mean, one reason the global financial system has been fairly centralized until for the last 3-4 decades has been to combat money laundering. And blockchain, one fear many financial regulators have, this decentralized system will enable money laundering. And I mean, yes, we all want some financial transactions to be anonymized at times. I mean, we all do stuff we're not proud of, but how would blockchain, how does privacy come into this entire money laundering aspect? I mean, obviously, financial regulators saying that money laundering is the greater evil. So how would you regulate that?
Can I just add to that? I think, as you know, there is also cryptocurrency or currency which is by digital fiat. And that's what really countries are looking at, including our regulator. So I'm from NASCOM. We've sat in a committee with the RBI listening to a whole presentation on cryptocurrency from ecurrency.net, which is also doing Estonia's digital currency. Right. So the central regulator's concern is absolutely that, the shadow economy, money laundering, etc. So if they adopt this, and the principles are similar, except that that's not a distributed database. Yeah. The same technologies are used, but it's controlled at the central level. So the generation of that currency is controlled at the central level. So I don't see the RBI or any central regulator really adopting a distributed blockchain kind of currency. They may not block it or ban it, because to them it could be like any other currency. You just have to figure out whether you want to allow convertibility or not. But if it's something they'll adopt, it would be a currency by central fiat, which is what Estonia is doing. Sweden is considering the e-krona, etc.
Yeah, money laundering is a very important issue, because in fact the pejorative implications with Bitcoin and by association blockchain have largely happened because the darknet, right? And use of Bitcoin to do a lot of transactions on the darknet, which you couldn't do with your currency online transactions to buy guns and so on, right? It's much more easily trackable. So to give a quick response to that, I think it will never be a public blockchain system. It will only be a permissioned ledger system if at all we move to using blockchain as use cases. And by permission ledger, where it could have a set of hierarchies, is that the final authority on the transaction will be the bank, and the bank is not going to give the go ahead to the transaction without eKYC or KYC being complied with by actors in that particular transaction. So I don't think a public blockchain system will be permitted by RBI or even be preferred by banks as a solution. On the currency front too, I think the answer is cryptocurrencies are by definition, because you have a central authority, but the idea is only to replace the physical with the digital. It's never going to be an equivalent to Bitcoin the way Bitcoin currently works. That's not going to happen. You will have a centralized body which is mining the currencies. It will not be a consensus mechanism to mine the currencies either. I don't think there will be even different nodes, even in a private blockchain architecture, mining it. It will be one authority mining it, which will be your RBI. So I don't think, we are going to have like a Bitcoin parallel.
It's really important. I'm glad you asked that, because it also applies to things like public land records, or having using a blockchain for tax filings, that everybody's tax filing is public. To me, one of the most interesting points is that when the US Treasury Department investigated the initial investigation, now of course it's become politicized, they were okay with the blockchain, especially the Bitcoin system. And to quote one of the people who worked in it, said, the holy grail of any investigator is to get access to an crime organization's bank accounts. And in a public blockchain, we have that access from day one. And so the worry for money laundering, for moving currencies, for making payments, or for the matter keeping public land records and having access to privacy, if all land records are public, can someone aggregate and find out, oh, here is somebody who's very rich who has a lot of land, let's go kidnap his kids? Because it becomes a personal security issue as well to have your financial or your land information, etc., up online, is what is called the knock list concept, where you have here are 35 Bitcoin accounts, 5 land record accounts, 17 these accounts, and they're all part of the blockchain. And people can see that transactions are going on between them and other actors. But the only point, the huge privacy point comes in is when somebody individually can be linked to those, which is where the KYC comes in. And it says that basically, look, that I could have 50, 100, 200 different accounts, and all those transactions are public. The problem that comes in, and the solution that comes in for a lot of governments, is to answer the question, at the end of this entire nice kabuki theater, can I link an individual to this account, and therefore, in the case of money laundering, prosecute them, saying that, look, this account did these crazy transactions, and I've identified the entire network based on the transaction, and based on a shipping address, because your Silk Road heroin arrived, and so I know this belongs to you, and then come and interrogate you physically and say, start naming all the people in the real world while you're working on the virtual world. But similarly, for the huge right to privacy, let's say we say, okay, we want all land records public, right? And so we put it in a public land records blockchain, or even online for that matter. What would the laws be around publicizing who owns that land record? What would be the protection of that person, that, hey, I have default anonymity because I have not said whether I own that account, but if the government as a source of trust outs me, or for example, a media organization does an investigation and says, oh, here are the 20 blockchain accounts linked to this individual, we found out through our sources and interviewed, and people trust them to do that. That's, for me, is when the privacy issue starts melting in there, but it's also the solution to the norms. As long as the RBI government or the government knows that the KYC for these blockchain accounts is done, they are less worried about the transactions and the public nature of it.
And we have the world's largest deduplication system in any way.
Hi, I'm Vinayak. Just probably a practical question, and also maybe a technology question. Is it really even feasible, even in a utopian setup, to have a setup which is not relying on trust of any nature? Because as we were discussing, in any regime or architecture, you will need some final arbiter or authority who's the trust. It could be the government, it could be large technology companies like Google or Facebook or what have you. Is it possible to create an architecture, one from a practical standpoint, second is from a technology architecture point of view, where you don't need the trust angle at all?
Add to what you were saying, I think the idea that a technology like blockchain or Bitcoin needs endorsement from a centralized body like RBI or something is kind of antithesis of the core idea, right? Because you don't need, and maintaining that fiat ratio and all system has failed. The problem is, even the existing centralized system, all nodes are not equally created. So in Bitcoin, all nodes are equally powered, right? So I don't think you need a EKI, KYC, or need to basically map a Bitcoin address or a blockchain address to an individual, what happens is that we, like in eBay or in Twitter, another, we have a reputation. If you basically do something and our account get blocked, you have to build that reputation again. Right now in blockchain, the reputation, money is exactly riding on that reputation. So if you do something nefarious, forensic accounting will catch up on you, and then your Bitcoin will be disabled. You lose real money then and there itself. Those solution will come, but saying that, okay, we again go back to feds and like state, I am strictly against giving disproportionate power to state actors, and that's what you're suggesting.
But Prashant,
So-
you're talking about a situation where it can't, what is that? You can't convince a person to change their mind when the job depends on.
Yeah, exactly.
So how can you tell the state that
But
this
who
would be
will
their
go?
role?
Do you think these guys will go for permission? Do you think the Bitcoin march of Bitcoin will go for permission to RBI? Ki, boss, please allow us. No, they are living in a bubble if they think that Bitcoin will ask for permission. Like internet never asks for permission.
Nikhil, can I just respond to that point that he had made about centralization versus, yeah. So I forget your name. Anyway, so on the issue of centralization, can there be? I mean, I'm an IP lawyer, right? And for years, the whole thing has been about who are these copyright societies which centralized the whole, licensing regime, right? I mean, you had these central guys, and basically it's like saying the house always wins. The society always won, whether authors and music composers and lyricists made any money out of it. Finally, or whether access was made more, democratic. Finally, the society used to win for many years, right? But today, Spotify, for instance, is thinking about using blockchain for, content access and sharing of royalties. So can we have a system where there is never a central authority? I think it's possible. I mean, Bitcoin really in some ways shows to us it's possible. The question is, how do regulators come after it? Are they comfortable with it, and in which domain are you using it? What asset class are you trading, for instance? For IP, for instance, I think it might actually work out to be a wonderful solution where, the architecture might override the central, body which negotiates on your behalf. That's
My name is Shikha Mehra, and I've been quite active in studying and understanding Bitcoins and blockchain. I would actually first like to answer a few of the comments that I heard over here. First of all, as far as money laundering goes, let's look at what the world that we live in today is. The annual money laundered is $1.6 trillion. 98% of that happens over the internet through traditional banking channels. That is so that in itself, that number should say a lot. Secondly, as latest research has come out, countries in Europe, Asia, and now the US, the Department of Homeland Security, and the IRS has come out as of 48 hours ago and said that Bitcoin is actually gives more of an audit trail than cash does, and it's easier to track criminals if they use Bitcoin. Because on the blockchain, all the data is public. What is published on the blockchain is their Bitcoin addresses. Bitcoin addresses are linked to their public keys. Public keys are stored and are linked to private keys. So what Bitcoin users have on their devices, either online or offline, are Bitcoin wallets. Now those Bitcoin wallets, how to track who owns those Bitcoin wallets? These are the names of the two companies so far. One is Chain Analysis and the other firm is Coin Firm. I've been working closely at the forefront with law enforcement agencies and have come out and said that only dumb criminals would use Bitcoins for money laundering or anything. Bitcoin leaves the entire audit trail, and the fact that only your digital identity, meaning the Bitcoin address, is public, it's as anonymous or not anonymous as using an email address. Today my name is Shikha Mehra. Over the internet, I can send and receive information, footballer@hotmail.com. Are we saying that that information exchange, because I'm saying not Shikha Mehra at hotmail.com, but footballer@hotmail.com is anonymous? No. Bitcoin address is like an email address. The same way my email address can be tracked back to my real world identity, just as easily Bitcoin address can be traced back to the real world identity. People always come up with examples of using the onion router, Tor, anonymizers, laundry mixers. All of them have been shutting shop. The largest ones have now shut shop, and law enforcement agencies around the world have caught up with that, which is how Silk Road got busted. The operator of eBTC, which is one of the largest Russian exchanges and Chinese exchanges owned by a Russian, was arrested in Greece. All the money that so-called, at the point that fiat converts to crypto or crypto converts to fiat, it happens through gatekeepers. Gatekeepers are the exchanges as we understand them today. All exchanges in India and around the world are currently following, and especially in India because we don't have a regulatory approach as yet, and we are waiting for the interministerial report to come out by the end of the year. But the DABFI, which is Digital Assets Blockchain Foundation of India, has appointed Nishit Desai Associates. Nishit Desai Associates has come out with a self-regulatory approach. I am the owner of Bitcoins. I've gone and bought over an exchange. All KYC norms I had to comply with. My PAN card, my bank account, my Aadhaar, everything submitted. They are following. So, and this is the consensus around the world, that gatekeepers should, legitimate gatekeepers should follow KYC norms. And as far as money laundering, terrorist financing, Bitcoin is now coming out to be more auditable than what has been happening currently. I started off by saying 98% of $1.6 trillion goes through our banking channels. So, and definitely cash is much more anonymous than Bitcoin. Cash, a 100 rupee note, you can't look at a 100 rupee note and decipher where all it's been. A Bitcoin, as soon as you have tracked it, you know exactly which Bitcoin address, from where it's got transferred and who it's moved from. And that Bitcoin address, law enforcement agencies, cybersecurity, is well within their power to track the wallet, to track the IP address through which I connect to the internet. Each device that I use to connect to the internet has a unique identifier. The IP address, very easily locatable and proven.